Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdcast Dave, and today I have the pleasure of hanging out with James Introcaso from MCDM Productions. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm great. I'm great, Dave. How are you?
Good. Just in case someone lives under a rock and they don't know what MCDM Productions are or who you are, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Yes. So I'm James Introcaso. I'm a role-playing game designer, and I'm the lead designer for MCDM. MCDM is Matt Colville's production company. A lot of your audience probably knows him because he's a YouTuber, and you're a YouTuber. And so I
Are
think
you
there's
saying all YouTubers just know each other?
I'm saying all RPG YouTubers might know each other.
Maybe. Maybe.
um, and so so I am the lead game designer for his publishing company. We make a lot of 5e products, and now we're starting to create our own high fantasy, heroic fantasy, I should say, role-playing game. So yeah, I'm really excited to be getting in on that. And then I have a bunch of other projects that I worked on. In fact, in 2 weeks, I got another book coming out called To Be or Not to Be a Villain, which is both a D&D and Zweihander adventure. Very exciting. So that's cool too. And I've worked with Cobalt Press, and I worked on 7 hardcover Wizards of the Coast books. And over at MCDM, we put out Arcadia Monthly Magazine. I used to be the managing editor of that. Now Hannah Rose has taken over and is doing a great job over there. And Flea Mortals is our latest Kickstarter. It's a big 5e monster book. We're making monsters that are fun to run and fun to fight. That's what I've been doing over there at MCDM.
As always, folks, you can find some links down in the description. Go check them out. So, you guys are working on your own RPG over there, but this isn't your first RPG that you've helped build.
Correct. Yeah, that's the first thing that I helped build from the ground up. The first RPG that I built from the ground up is called Burn Bright, and it was designed for Roll20. So Roll20 commissioned me and some other designers to make it. It's a science fantasy role-playing game, and it is exclusive to their platform. You can still buy it. It's called Burn Bright, Bryte. And it is a labor of love that is pretty weird in that it requires the VTT to run. And so we tried to take advantage of a lot of the VTT's tools. Like, for instance, you roll a ton of dice, which is easy to do on a VTT because it can quickly do all the math for you and stuff like that. And maps are kind of required to play. Again, easier to do on a VTT because you can just grab a map and throw it right there in what you're using. I worked on that. There's a whole core rulebook, a couple of adventures, a monster and spaceship expansion. Yeah, it was really fun to work on that. Thank you for asking about that.
Yeah, well, we're not really that focused on these chats, and it's kind of whatever. But I thought it'd be
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
cool to bring you on and talk about, just general game design principles. And there's a huge difference between being a GM and a game master and being a game designer. But I think it's lost on a lot of people in the community because the nature of GMing is to make stuff all the time. So you're like, well, I can do that. But there's a huge difference between you making something and then you making something that someone else can then interpret and use easily.
Huge, as you know very well, right? Out of the
Yeah.
box encounters is made for, hey, you basically you need something right now, right away to go. Like, let's drop this on, right? And you started making those online before you put those into a book, and I think that probably helped you, right? Because then you
Yeah.
got all of that sweet internet feedback, which is both helpful and
Hurtful.
demoralizing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I must say, for Out of the Box Encounters, we were not the lead designers. One of our writers were. And they put it on there. Mike Gould did a fantastic job, put it on the website. And then we're like, hey, let's just take this to Kickstarter because this would make a fantastic book, a great resource for people.
It really is. It's great. And that's, I think when you are a game designer, that's what you really need to think about is who is this for, right? And how am I communicating what the way things should be to them in a concise and clear way, and also not leaving them with a lot of work, right? So like a lot of times, especially when I'm working with new designers, I get a lot of work that um feels like your notes, right? Like the
Yeah.
GM notes you would leave. And it's like, well, hang on. Well,
Yeah.
you know what this means because you wrote it, but it needs to make sense to somebody who didn't write it. It needs to make sense to somebody who's reading it. Which often means adding more words or cutting things down, right? Saying like, well, we could explain this idea, but it's going to take 10,000 words to do it. And this is one encounter. So we should probably not do that. And we should figure out what is a more clear and concise way to do this rather than this very complicated way. And so that's the thing you're really looking at. And a lot of times when someone is new, I did this too, you'll get stuff where it's like, you can and like another piece of treasure decided by the GM, right? Or adjudicate the encounter to the best of your ability, or things
Yeah.
like that are vague or leave a lot of decisions up to the GM. And the secret is that all GMs know they can change things, right? That's like the
Yes.
number one rule of the game. And so I find that like if you give a GM hey, now it's your turn to do the design work here, they don't like that. They're paying for somebody else to do it. They know they can change it if they want to.
Yeah.
So I always give them that and say like, here's what the magic item is, here's what it does, here's how you resolve this encounter, here's what happens if you don't do X, Y, or Z, rather than saying you pick something that you like. They'll do that if they want to. They know that they can. So give them the script, let them change it if they want to, but don't tell them to write it, is a big thing that we run into a lot. And it's like, well, don't GMs want flexibility? Yeah, they do, but they have it. The game
Yeah.
gives that to them. You need to do the prep for them. That's what they came for.
Yeah, like when when Doug was working with us, he was great for that. Like he was great for holding our feet to the fire and being like, "Yeah, but how did they get into that room? How did this
Mhm.
happen?" Asking those questions. So now that I don't have Doug to lean on, I have to channel my inner Doug to be like, "All right, what are these things?" Because I feel like and this is probably a problem for like new game designers specifically is if you've been running games for a long time these obstacles aren't problems for you
Right.
because you're just used to dealing with them on the fly and it's not a big deal. But people are paying for you to remove those obstacles for them.
Exactly. And I think, a lot of times people complain about a product, right? Because it makes more work for them. And
Yeah,
so that's the big thing. And people like it when you talk to them in a way that's fun to read, certainly, and conversational and that kind of thing. But there's a lot of, especially if you're like you said, an older GM, there's a lot of assuming things, right?
yeah,
Where it's like, well, they'll know this. They'll know what this means. They'll know how to do this. And it's like, well, not necessarily. I have to remove that bias from myself all the time because I've been running games since I was 10. And so it's like, well, yeah, of course, some of this stuff is second nature to me, but there's a lot of people who are sitting down to run their first game and they might be using your adventure,
yeah,
right? Or even if it's their first time running a horror style game, or it might be their first time running the RPG that you wrote the adventure for, or your RPG, right? And so taking it back to basics, I think, or not necessarily basics, but being clear about what the expectation is and how things are supposed to work is really, really important. And it's also important for how it interacts with other rules, right? So like the way you word something, it's almost like a programming language. It needs to be specific so that it interacts with all of the other rules in the game. And there's going to be questions about like, well, how would dispel magic work with this, or how does true seeing work here, or that kind of thing. And so you need to keep those in mind and say, okay, if I word this the right way and I'm familiar with the language of the game, then those questions are easily answered, right? But if I just say something like there's magical darkness here, that for many GMs will know what it means. Others will be like, well, the darkness spell that creates magical darkness actually specifies that you can't see through it with dark vision, and that magical light can't. And so I don't know if that's the case with this darkness or not, because you just
Yeah.
said magical darkness, right? So it's that kind of thing.
Especially a game like 5e, the language is very intentional and specific.
Yeah,
For
exactly.
better or worse, because you definitely see things where the designers figured out later, like that's not
Hmm.
what we meant, right? Or that like it makes the game a little less fun in a certain way. And with the one D&D playtest, you see them grappling with that in the better instances of one D&D.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's that the 1D&D rules, right, have not gone through the total refined filter that they will go through by the end of the process, to catch even more of that stuff. And we have the benefit now of being almost 10 years away from
Yeah,
fifth edition's launch. And so we can see how it's aged and that sort of thing. And I think one of the things that is true about fifth edition is there's so much in the player's handbook. There's so much in the core rules that you could play the game for a long time without ever really feeling like you want other stuff. But so that makes it hard to design more stuff for it, right? Because it's
yeah,
like, well, should I make this? Oh, well, actually, that's a 18th level ranger ability, so you can't give that to a 5th level whatever subclass you're making, right?
yeah,
And so it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess, all right, let me think about this and take it back to basics. And so the game is so big and so vast just in its core rules that even when WotC puts out stuff, sometimes it's like, oh, we didn't realize there would be a weird interaction here
yeah.
between these.
Like I think like one of the primary things, which was, and I think a lot of us feel like it was kind of a happy um accident with like
Mhm.
rogue sneak attack. The fact that like they never meant for the rogue to sneak attack when it wasn't their turn
Right.
in the round, but it creates fun moments at the like, and they're fixing it now, unfortunately. But it created fun moments at the table where the players work together and use
Yeah.
a sequence of abilities that they otherwise wouldn't have a reason to do, or the fighter, will give up their attack so the rogue can try and get their sneak attack in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really very, and those rules, when those things happen, which is why playtesting is really important. We do a ton of playtesting at MCDM. When you're building a game that is as vast and as deep as something like 5e, um, that's where you catch all those edge cases and stuff,
Yeah,
and then you have to decide as the designer, hey, do I like this? Is this
yeah,
good, right? Is this a good thing? We're constantly doing that. We have all these playtesters who are really sharp and really know the game, the fifth edition, really well. And so they'll bring up some interesting interactions or be like, how does this work? And then I often have to think about like, well, I didn't intend for that, but does that mean it's bad? Right. And sometimes the answer is no. Like, yeah, this is cool. This actually enhances what we're trying to do. We always start with, as designers, what is the fiction? What are we trying to do? What's the story we're trying to tell? What is the fiction we're trying to emulate? Right. Um, and then how do we support that with rules? And what are we trying to do? That's like our North Star. And we're always supporting that and thinking about like, well, does this rule do that? Does it support the idea of, in the case of the game we're making, right, like being a hero, heroic fantasy. Um, and so when an something like that comes up, we have to say like, okay, well, like the rogue sneak attack, well, it's encouraging teamwork. That's really good. That's what we
yeah.
want, right? D&D is all about the party. And so, well, but how does it throw things off in terms of damage? Okay, well, it does this and this. It's like, okay, well, maybe what we need to do is adjust how much damage sneak attack does rather than you can use it every turn, or like that kind of thing. It's which of those levers do you choose to play with? Because if it's fun for people, right, like that's like the number one point of most games is you want everybody to have fun, then you probably want to keep it. But the question is, how do you keep it so it doesn't also step on the fun of other people? Maybe the fighter doesn't like giving up their attack, but they feel like they need to because the rogue can deal so much damage, right? So it's that kind of thing.
What would be like? some advice you would give someone who wants to break into game design? How do you cross over from being a GM that just makes stuff to being a designer that now makes stuff for other GMs to interpret?
Yeah. Well, so one thing I want to say, right, is that like full stop, all game designers or all GMs are game designers. Because if you've made a magic item, if you've built an encounter, if you've created some little spell or that sort of thing, you've designed a piece of the game, right? Whether or
Yeah.
not you've published it. Now that's what we're talking about, right? The difference between like what does it take to publish and what does it take to GM. And so the big thing that I would say to people, advice is that like this day and age, and Dave, you know this better than anybody, you've got to start creating for yourself first before you end up working with other people. There aren't a lot of like, hey, we're accepting pitches from first-time writers for this, or we're looking for somebody who's never worked in games before, right?
Yeah.
Like, I got my job, and I know a lot of people who this is the case by putting stuff out there on my own, self-publishing, right? So it started as for me on a blog, and then the blog stuff on the blog then went to the DMs Guild and stuff on the and then I started to write for the Adventurers League because my stuff on the DMs Guild did okay, right? But I blogged and wrote for myself for about 2 or 3 years before I ever booked a job with anybody else. And the good news is this day and age, it's easier to publish your own stuff, and it's easy to I shouldn't say it's easy. It's easier than it was 30 years ago to monetize your stuff, right? And so so you can be working for yourself and making your stuff. And there's a lot of creators who sometimes will approach and say, "Hey, do you want to work for us?" And they're like, "Well, I make a pretty good decent
Yeah.
chunk of change on my own. So like let's talk, let's negotiate, right?"
Getting cartographers and nowadays is really hard.
Yeah, it really is. Well, because a cartographer can make a killing on Patreon if they're really good, and good they should. And so working out a deal with a cartographer often these days looks something like hey, we'd like to commission a map and you can give it to your patrons, right? Because then it's like
Yeah.
then they're making money for something that they're also going to do anyway.
Yes.
Right, and make money on, and that's the everybody wins in that scenario. And so it's as publishers changing the way you think. But yeah, I think it's a lot of doing it on your own, and then it's a lot of being involved in the community, right? I think you want to put your stuff out there, and so in order to do that you need to join the community. It's great. You'll meet a lot of people, like it's how you and I met, right? And they're cool folks who have the same interest as you. And what you should be doing is not just taking from the community. Don't just put stuff out there and say, give me views, give me feedback, give me also do what other people are asking of you. If somebody else is out there asking for feedback, take a look at it. Give as good as you get. Give better than you get, because it makes the community a better place. And if you help foster a good community, you're going to find good people who want to work with you and who are going to promote your stuff. And and it's not like I promoted you, you promoted me. It's like find people that you're excited about and lift them up, and people who are excited about you will find you and lift you up. And it's great. It's one of the best feelings in the world to be part of a greater community and feel like you're giving to it.
Do you have a favorite type of content you like to produce for, a favorite kind of design, things you like to design, whether it's monsters, items, new games, whatever?
Yeah. So I love working on new games. I'm thrilled with what we're doing right now at the MCDM RPG. I loved working on Burn Bright. So I love doing that. And I love working on adventures quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I really like thinking about fun things that can happen, designing encounters, designing NPCs and motivations, and what is the story of this adventure going to be. I really, really love that. it also changes depending on what I'm currently working on. So we're finishing up a big monster book, and I kind of feel like I never want to look at another stat block again, right? But as we move off of that, right, and maybe I start working on an adventure or something like that. I'll say like, well, I really like making monsters and forget adventures.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you can get sick of one thing if you do it a lot. But for me, the thing that's cool about adventures is you can always make them different, right? You can always find a different way in, a different genre, a different experience, with adventures. And so that's cool. Whereas like a monster, when you're working on 300 monster stat blocks, you're kind of like, how can I make this monster different than the other 299? Like, why is it worthy of
Yeah.
being a monster in its own right? What does it do that the others don't do? Why is it interesting? And that's hard. Like iteration like that at that level where it's like fine detail work can get hard when you're doing a lot of it.
So Retrospect has a question,
No.
but I think we need you to drill down on that a little bit because he asked, "What does a graphic designer do?" That's very vague. Like, they make logos.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
design graphics.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, in terms of RPGs, right? Like, graphic designers do logo stuff, and they can also do what's called layout in a book,
yeah.
which is essentially like taking the text and the images and putting them together in a way that looks interesting and is informative and is part of really the design of the game, as much as it is the design of the visuals too, right? It's like the way you lay out and present your presentation is part of your game design.
And there's so many things that go into game design, right? Because you have stat block
Mm-hmm.
writing, which is different than story writing. Yeah, the
Yeah.
layout, the editing, the copy editing, the the system editing. Like, there's so many
Yeah.
parts.
Yeah, right. There's the first thing about design, right, is there are these two things that you have to do. You have to be good at designing game mechanics, right, which are the math of the game
Yeah,
and how does the fun of that, right? Like, is this a fun thing that we're doing here when we roll the dice? Pick up to roll the dice and we're fighting a monster. Is that fun? But then there's also the prose writing, and the prose writing is just as important because we often call them like crunch in the mechanics and
yeah,
fluff, as if you're making a fluffernutter with crunchy peanut butter, but really your prose are just as important, especially because like this day and age, gamers, when they read prose, treat them like mechanics often, right? So if you say I don't know, goblins drool acid, right? Uh, your reader is going to assume that that is true of all goblins, right? Or if you
yeah,
say humans are greedy, your reader is going to assume that is true of all humans. And what you might be saying is like, for dramatic effect, many humans are greedy, but of course there are some who are not, right? Which is why you often end up with like hedging in some RPG prose where it's like, well, many humans are this, but some are not, and blah blah blah. And I think that that is good. That's a good thing, especially when we're describing different peoples. To do
yeah.
that, we just need to write it in such a way that it's still evocative and interesting and that sort of thing. So that's why prose is difficult, and it's hard, and it's an important part of the game just as much as you get +1 on attacks with this longsword. So which is a mechanical thing, and that's just writing.
Yeah.
When you get into editing, there's a lot of different kinds of editing. Like you were saying, I do a lot of what's called development editing. Development editing is looking at stuff and saying to you, hey, Dave, if you're the author, right? Like, hey, uh, the way you've written this means that now every player heals when they fall in the lava instead of dying. Is that your intent, right? And if so, we should make that clear, because right now it seems like they should be dying when they fall in the lava.
Yeah.
Or oh, you know what? It looks like this monster hits a little too hard, or this encounter looks like it might be a little too easy, or like, and so on and so on and so on. That's development editing. Copy editing is commas and apostrophes and fixing verbiage and writing things to strengthen the way they sound and that sort of thing. So yeah, and that's just copy editing and development editing, which are probably like the two most common. But yeah, there's a lot of different things that happen in RPGs.
Yeah. So what do you like? What, like, do you like switching from system to system? Does it matter to you when you're doing design? Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I mean, I love working on different systems. I certainly, if you have a mastery of one system, it can make it easier, right? Like, I've been writing a lot of 5e stuff, and so 5e comes pretty naturally to me. I don't have to look up as much stuff as if I'm working in another system.
Yeah.
Although the game is deep enough that I still do look up a lot while I'm writing. But there is a lot of frustrating things about working in every system. Has its frustrations, I guess is the best way to put it. And for a game like 5e, there's so much content for it that's what can kind of make it frustrating to write for. Is there's all this official content, and often we're taking that into account. And it's also a game that has 20 levels. And so that spreads out a lot of stuff, right? We have that means 20 levels across the number of classes just in the core rulebook means that there's already a lot of player abilities. Going to be hard not to duplicate some of those. There's already 300 spells in the player's handbook. Going to be hard to not find a thing that a spell already does, right? There's already a bunch of feats. There's already a bunch of monsters to fill all the gaps at those levels and stuff like that. And so what's hard about designing in that system is taking all of that stuff into account, especially when, and this is the thing that is most frustrating about it, is like there aren't that many people playing all 20 levels of the game.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a game with 20 levels that really most people are playing the first, 8.
Yeah.
And so that, and of those, most people are playing the first 4. And so that's,
Or they're skipping the first
thing.
3,
right?
And then
Yeah,
playing the next 5, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. But there aren't that many people playing games above 10th level, and I bet, there are millions of people playing D&D. But how many people do you think within the last month have sat down at a game and actually played a 20th level ranger, right? I don't know. Probably less than 1,000.
Yeah. At best, if you run a campaign all the way out, it's like you get the 20th level and then you run a session at 20th level and then you're done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and I mean, there are certainly, I'm sure there's a lot of people who would be the exception to what we're talking about, right? But yeah, I feel like that's true for the most part. It's like by the time you get to 20th level, you're eager to play a different character.
Yeah.
You want to try something new. The GM's eager to get back to goblins and kobolds. Like it's and so I do think that makes D&D hard to design for sometimes. Is there's all this stuff. And then the other thing that makes D&D hard to design for is like there's a lot of weird legacy things that are in the game just because it's D&D.
Yeah.
But you have to get around those things, or you need to incorporate, like a best case scenario, you incorporate those things, right? Things like the fact that you have ability scores and modifiers. You don't need both.
Yeah, yeah. The score is pointless anymore.
Yeah. Or we have a web spell and an entangle spell. I don't know that we need both, right? Like it's that kind of thing where, and they are slightly different. Don't at me. But they're not different enough for
Mhm.
there to like really be a reason to have two, other than there's always been a web spell and there's always been an entangle
Well,
spell. And we need
there's a
those.
nice hack that I like, and that is because there is so much in the game already. If you want to design something or do something, someone has already written the mechanics out for you, most likely. All you need to do is find it and tweak it a little bit, and you don't, right? So
Yes.
it saves you the trouble of like figuring out exactly how you would phrase this particular ability you're trying to come up with.
Yeah, exactly. And that, I mean, that is a huge thing. I'm always doing a copy paste because it's
Yeah.
like, how should this work? Oh, it should probably work sort of like the darkness spell, but instead, it's a chocolate sauce that's filling the air. And like, okay, well, let's go and I'll copy and paste that language, and then we're
Yeah.
ready to go. And the cool thing about the system reference document and the D&D's rules now being in the Creative Commons is that like you're cool to do that. You're
Yeah.
cool to lift direct phrases often and use those. Or like if we're designing a monster and the monster has the amorphous trait, right, which a
Yeah.
lot of oozes have, and some other, like we're just going to use the same wording as the amorphous or the magic resistance trait. Like these are common traits. And one thing I love about fifth edition is that if you know what magic resistance is, right, if you know what that trait means, you know what it means as soon as you see it on any other creature. You don't need to read the full description.
Yeah.
And or amphibious or anything like that, and that they're consistent about it, right? It's not called amphibious over here and then over here called like amphibian gills or frog face or something like that, right? Like it's always consistent, which like fourth edition D&D was very guilty of. Had a lot of abilities that did the same thing but all had different names, and that was frustrating, especially when you had like 7,000 monster stat blocks.
Yeah, yeah, when you're relearning something, but you're not really. It's just like a waste
Yeah.
of time.
Yeah, exactly. So developing a common language is great, right? And you as a designer learning that common language is a plus. It's going to really help you in your career, and just knowing where to go look for it helps. Like nobody's got it memorized, right? Even Jeremy Crawford, if he's answering questions, is opening up the player's handbook to look at stuff, and he wrote the thing.
Yeah.
So but it's good to be able to say like, how did they phrase this? Okay, what is it going to mean too, right? Like that's the other thing is, what does it mean if I rephrase this, right? So like saying one of the things that I really like to use, and I think our editor on Flea Mortals, shout out to Laura Hirschbrunner, very good, amazing editor on that book.
The unsung heroes of the industry.
For real, yeah. Editors are amazing. They're amazing people. We talk a lot about like the phrase "lose hit points," right? Because that's not really a thing you see in 5e that often. It's often about taking a certain type of damage, right? So you
Hmm.
take fire damage or piercing or whatever. And in Flea Mortals, there are a few places where we use lose hit points on purpose. And the reason we use that on purpose is like, we don't want you to get around damage resistance or immunity with this.
Oh
And
yeah.
so, but it's an established convention that is used in a couple places. So, like the Sturge in the monster manual, when they attach to you and they're sucking your blood, you lose hit points. You're not taking necrotic damage or piercing damage or anything like that. You're losing hit points. Same thing with the bearded devil. I think when they hit you with their beard, they leave a wound that like you're bleeding from and you lose hit points. So yeah, that's it's learning language like that can really help you out, because you could be like, aha, how do I get around these things now? These conventions. Well, there are some exceptions, and here they are.
I mean, that is one of the kind of like the cool things, and also one of the hard things about the game, right? It's the rules are exception based, so learning what those exceptions are can be tricky. But also, like you said, it's also once you do learn them,
Mm-hmm.
you have more tools in your toolbox to implement.
Exactly. Yeah, reading helps a lot. So reading products, running products, right? And this is the thing is, as a designer, one of the things I had to train out of myself was like, I feel like I have a separate brain when I'm reading something versus when I'm designing it.
Yeah.
And so when you are designing, think about yourself as the reader and think like, would I want this to say this, or am I doing this to make my life as a designer easier? Because often, right, that's how we get a lot of that stuff where it's like, you decide, GM, blah blah blah. And it's like, well, no, if I was the reader, I would be upset by that. But as the writer, it certainly makes my job easier to just tell the GM to decide, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of thing, pushing yourself to be like making the product you would want to buy, right, I think is really important and helpful. And it's how we get stuff like out of the box, right? Because that is a thing that like I believe I've seen you use at tables before.
I don't know if you've seen me use it, but I definitely have used it.
Yeah.
Things I love tools like that that just make your life easier.
Yeah.
And like bite-sized tools too. Like for me, an adventure is way too much. Like,
Mm-hmm.
out of the abyss, like,
Oh, sure. Yeah. Really long adventures can be a lot. Yeah.
yeah, it seems like a lot of work for me anyway to read it and then not fix it, but cater it to what I want at the table. It's like I'm like I
Yeah.
could have just made something up, and it would have been faster.
Well, and a lot of times that gets worse as the adventure goes on, right? Because if you change one thing over here, all of
Yeah,
a sudden, it's the butterfly effect. It has all these ripples out. And by the time you're at the end, you're like, well, I just threw this out and now I'm doing my own thing. And basically the only thing that's the same is you fight Orcas at the end or whatever.
yeah.
Um, one of the things that's really interesting about what you just said about like giving people tools, we did a survey for Arcadia, which is our magazine, about like what sort of articles do you like? And right, we try to put 3 useful content articles in there. So magic items, spells, adventures, NPCs, stuff you can drop right into your game. Sometimes they're little rule sets. And one of the things that was, I thought like people are going to come back and say like, give us those, short 1 to 2 session adventures. That's what we want, right? And that was a popular choice, but
Yeah.
that wasn't as popular as just give me encounters that I can drop in, right? And that the encounters weren't as popular as give me monsters, right?
Yeah.
And what's cool about that is each one of those is the building block of the previous, right? So like you use monsters to build encounters and you use encounters to build an adventure. And so a lot of GMs do want just the building blocks of something. And it's one reason why I think a lot of times we can default to combat as GMs, because we have this book of 300 plus monsters that you can just grab and throw a bunch out there and you're ready to go, and there you go, that's an encounter. And so having a book like out of the box encounters, or a book of traps, or a book of NPC negotiations, right, that's helpful, because not only does it say like, well, now it's easy to drop in other kinds of encounters than combat encounters, also it's easy now to see how these things are made, right? You read and run enough monsters, you're like, I could do this. I could make some monsters. It's the same thing. If you read and run enough traps, enough social encounters, enough puzzles, then you can do it yourself too.
I think since playing 5e, I've literally run one adventure, and
Wow, which one?
Orcas Claws. Um, and just because I just liked it because it was holiday themed, it is for like a
Yes.
4th or 5th level party. I ran it for a 17th level party. Um, and like, but that being said, like things like be prepared from Kobold Press, or even like dipping in and out of the box encounters, like I've used those things over and over again, just because it's like, well, I just need something to fill this spot, and I don't have any ideas right now. Let me flip through here. I'm like, oh, this is perfect. This is fun.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
amazing. I have a lot of questions that I'd like to ask about Orcas Claws.
Yeah.
Where do I buy this adventure? And is Orcus like a Krampus type figure in it?
It kind of is, complete with demonic reindeers.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
yeah, it was put out by Frog God Games a few years back. And I just like the cover, and it's funny too. Like I think like the session before, I used a monster that had some kind of like charm or mind control power, and it just so happened like I did it to to the battle master ranger, and he just put the womp on the party. And it's like
Yes.
the very next session, Orcas Claws has the same type of ability, and it happened again. And I mean,
That's
like when
awesome.
you have those overpowered characters, it's just like the best thing you can do is just use them against the rest of the party.
Exactly. And that's that kind of thinking, right, is really fun, and that's
Yeah,
what makes GMs game designers, and I think that's what gets a lot of people into like, oh yeah, I could do this. And I will say, there's like absolutely no shame in not wanting to in just wanting to GM,
yeah.
and not wanting to try to publish something professionally.
Well,
First, we
yeah,
need a lot of those people buying stuff, but yeah.
it's nice to just enjoy the hobby, enjoy your hobby, right? Like, and
Exactly.
not my. I think like in in the states, a lot of times we want to try and monetize our hobbies,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, it's true.
there's a pitfall to that. Like I've done so many of these where I talk to people and bring on streamers, and I'll be like, well, how often do you play to just play and have fun and have a non-stream game? And this like dumbfound look will just come across their face. A- And my advice to anyone that, especially like streamers, is like keep at least one game for yourself and like just be able to
Absolutely.
like enjoy it, let your hair down. Don't have to be performing and on all the time.
Yeah, it's funny. You and I play in a game every Saturday with a lot of streamers, and designers and stuff. And when it started, it's been going for a couple of years now. But when it started, there were a lot of them were like, "Wow, this is really nice to have a game
Yeah.
that isn't streamed." And it's for me, it's the opposite. I'm like, "Oh, I guess it's fun to play in a stream game from time to time, right?" But
Yeah,
like, it is
same. Like
stressful. Yeah.
we've always kept games where. Well, I guess that's not entirely true. There was a period where we were recording our games very early on. There wasn't
Mhm.
many people doing it at the time, and you know, and it was so nice when we stopped doing that.
Sure. Yeah,
And
yeah.
also like the way we were doing it was kind of shitty. It wasn't intentional, but we like conscripted our friends and like, look, we're doing this nerdarchy thing. We want to put our games online, and they were okay with it. But like, it does change what's going on at the table, and they're just like regular people. And there's been so many times that like, thank God they were pre-recorded games and not live games, where we're like,
Yeah.
okay, write down this timestamp. Because we're gonna have to go and fix something.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is definitely, a live game is stressful and you're drained by the end of it and stuff. And like that game on Saturday when it's done, I'm always like raring to go. I'm like, I wish we were playing for another 6 hours.
It energizes
Um,
you instead of like being a drain.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it also, from a design perspective, um, it's good because it gets you in touch with how most people are going to interact with the thing that you're creating. Most people are not going to stream your game, right?
Yeah.
They're gonna play your game with a bunch of friends. They're gonna make a bunch of dick jokes, and have a great time.
And not
Um,
only that, the parts that you think are really important as
mhm.
a game designer get used far less streaming than they do at just like a normal person's table.
Absolutely. That's like 100,000% true.
Mechanics are
Yeah.
not exciting to watch on a stream. Matter of fact, like when we were campaign 2 started for Critical Role, we're like, it's the
Mhm.
beginning, it's a good part to jump in and we'll start reviewing it. I would fall asleep whenever they'd roll initiative. Like I couldn't keep my eyes open. It was so boring to me. Um
Yeah. And we're
and
talking about like the Game of Thrones in terms of production quality and of RPGs, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's true. Yeah. It like fast forward to the end. Tell me who won.
Yeah, kind of like can I get the highlights, right? Or the montage where
Mhm.
like it was far more interesting watching them interact with each other and the NPCs and maybe
Yeah.
solving problems. But rolling a D20, not nearly as exciting as you would think.
Yeah, very exciting to do, right? Very
Yes.
exciting to be there and to be the ones rolling and fighting for your characters' lives. It for a lot of people, I do think it's less exciting to watch someone else do it. And obviously, for a lot of people do like that, right? Like
Yeah.
there's Critical Role wouldn't be what it is without that. And but I do think Critical Role's biggest strengths are probably in the scenes between the combats and Critical Role is fascinating to me because I think one reason I enjoy it, and I think a lot of other people like watching it, is like it's for many people the ideal D&D game, right?
Yeah.
They meet once a week.
Yeah.
um
That's the real
and
fantasy right there.
yeah, but then because they meet and they're doing it all because they make money doing it, right?
Mhm.
That's why they're able to hold this commitment is
Yeah.
they and many other people's jobs depend on them doing it once a week. And so they're able to meet once a week, but then they're also able to take the time to really play at like a slow but still exciting pace. And so like you get scenes where it's like, yeah, we're going to spend the next half hour just having people up on watch talking to each other, right?
Yeah.
And it's these 2x2 conversations that like a lot of times if you're playing in a game with your friends, it's you only have the game once this month. You're trying to cram it into 3 hours, right? And it's like, okay, yeah, watch happens and then we move on. Okay,
Yeah.
you buy a sword and then we move on, right? Like, and so I think for a lot of people, that's part of the appeal of these shows. Is it's like, this is what I wish my game could be like, because look at this like pacing that they have. That's really great. They also are all obviously very good friends who trust each other, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's important too. Like, yes, the voice acting's great, but like the fact that they're willing to be very vulnerable with each other, I think, is often a thing that even the people we play D&D with were like, I don't know. I think they'll probably laugh at me if I try to, have like a
Yeah.
vulnerable moment here like this or whatever. So, yeah.
So Avram Krovax, which I'm probably mispronouncing, how or what
Avram.
how or what would you do with a new player who doesn't know what to do or what they even can do or should be doing? I try to engage that person, and he seems to just clam up when it's his turn.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, great question. There are all kinds of players, and some players who are new are very content to watch, and that makes players that can make GMs who don't like to watch often because they're in the GM chair nervous, right? And like,
Mm.
well, it seems like this person isn't having fun because they're not engaging with the game the way I would. So I think that's the first thing, is to like have a conversation above the table and say like, hey, I notice sometimes when we get to your turn, like you might be freezing up, or it looks like I'm trying to engage you to see what you want to do, and sometimes it seems like maybe I'm putting the spotlight on you. I don't want to put you on the spot like that. Like, let me talk about like what is the best way. What do you like about the game? How can I better engage you? What are you looking for, right? And like ask them about that, and just have that conversation above the table. Um, Honestly, if you can, right? Sometimes you don't know the person that well, or you might not feel comfortable doing that, and that's cool too. But I think that's like the best way to address those issues, is mainly saying like, hey, is I notice you're not as engaged as some of the other players. Just wanted to check in and make sure that you're still having fun, and if there's anything that I could do to make the experience better for you, or that kind of thing. And if they're like, no, I'm fine, this is just how I like to play, then great, as long as you're okay with that, right? If there are things that you can do, then start incorporating them. If the character has something that's tied to their backstory, or if there's anything you've noticed that they do like to do, right? Like where it's like, oh, I do like that I'm the rogue and I get to pick locks, right? Or I like to try to pick pockets, or it's spell components are really important to me.
Or you
I had a
really love
player that was
finding
true.
secret doors.
Yeah, you really love finding secret doors. I think putting that in a little bit more, and then letting that test the waters to see if that draws them out more, is also a good way to go. Because if you but I would start there with like, just ask them, what do they like? What do they want to do? That's a lot of these problems, I think, are fixed by above the board conversations.
Yeah, step one is always determining, is it a in-game problem or an out-of-game problem, or if it's a problem at all, really, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
some people are just wallflowers, and like you said, they just want to watch, and they really are happy to just be there and be around other people. But maybe they're more reserved, they're introverts. And I've definitely have seen and heard stories where people will be like that for years, and then all of a sudden they just kind of like step into the game in a way that they haven't before.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you don't feel like it's detracting from the table and they're having a good time, it could very well be a non-issue. But like everything that you brought up, like finding, trying to figure out what they do like, and tying their backstory into it, making things about the players' characters. And it just goes for all. Like anytime a GM's like, players never take my hooks, they never want to get involved, and the things I try to have them do. And usually it always just comes down to, well, it's you're trying to have them do your stuff instead of their stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true, right? And that might be the thing. There's all kinds of reasons that could be happening, and it always helps to have that above the table conversation. So and generally away from the other players too, right? Like
Yeah.
you don't want to put them on the spot about this in front of the whole group. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just good to it's good to do a session 0 before you start a campaign, but
Mm-hmm.
you can always revisit that and kind of like see where people are at, what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying.
Yeah.
And you might need to do it individually, so people don't feel like they're being called out. It just depends on your group dynamic a lot of times too.
Yeah, I mean this is really nerdy, but like I generally halfway through a campaign um will sometimes send out an email to the whole group and say like, hey, BCC folks, so that when they reply, it just comes to me and just say like, hey, um, let me know how you think it's going so far, and like, is there anything you want to see? Well, like our story is halfway done. And I want to make sure that you're achieving the story beats you want to achieve, and like what else do you want your character to do before that kind of thing. I think can help. I know some people who do that every session. They're like,
Yeah,
what did you like? What could I have done better? Let me know. And the players, giving the players the right to be like, yeah, you don't have to respond if you don't want to. You don't want to give them
yeah,
homework necessarily. But that can be really helpful just in general to get a beat on stuff. I remember one time I was weaving this very convoluted story with a group that had seemed to like that kind of thing in the past, but I think I got like way too many layers and threads and things like that.
yeah,
Uh, that when the players, um, that when I sent out that email, like unanimously, they were like, it's too confusing. I don't know what's going on anymore. And I was like, oh, okay, let's simplify it. Get back to basics.
yeah. But reading the table is a huge part of being the GM, and figuring out what's working and what isn't. But you can simplify that a lot by what you just summed up. Ask.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Ask.
So, what are you working on nowadays that's not D&D?
Great question. So, hang on. Let me grab it. So, we're working on the MCDM RPG. This is not the MCDM RPG. This is another thing. But I do want to talk about that real quick. But the MCDM RPG that we are currently working on, and we're working on it a little bit at a time. We're actually like live blogging the process on Patreon right now.
Okay.
About whenever we can, we do like a big update. Matt just did a big like 6,000 word update about where the state of the game is and what our last playtest was like.
Mm.
So that game is what we're creating is a heroic fantasy game. So the idea is you will be heroes. This isn't a game about like counting torches or rations or arrows or that kind of thing. It's about
Yeah.
saving the world. And that's what a heroic fantasy game is, right? Like
Are
we're
you saying we
talking
can't save the world one piece of ammo and one torch at a time?
You can. There are certainly people run games like that. But I think it's easier to
Mhm.
do that. And when you're writing a role playing game, a lot of it's about like what are the things we want to enforce, right? What's the fantasy we want to enforce? And the fantasy we want to enforce is that you're a big damn hero, and you can do cool stuff. And so right now we're experimenting with a lot of things. It doesn't use conventional role-playing game dice, doesn't use the D&D dice, doesn't use a D20. It's going to use original dice with symbols on them that we have,
Everybody
not
loves
like
those.
numbers. What?
Everybody loves those.
Well, you should read the comments because not everybody loves those.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, but we're gonna make those as accessible as possible. We got a lot of plans to make it easy for people to get those dice. They're probably gonna come with the game. When you
Yeah.
buy one MCDM RPG, whatever form that takes, we'll probably have a way of giving you dice to start, and then there's going to be other ways to get them too.
Yeah.
But
In
we've
the current
also
iteration, are you going to need a bunch of those dice, or is like one set enough?
That's a good question. So in the current iteration, you'll probably need a bunch, but we'll see. It might be possible for the game to come with a bunch, right? It may also be possible for us to partner with dice makers. So if you want a fancy set of dice, because you love fancy dice or you're a dice collector, or you believe in the precision of those dice more, then
Yeah.
that may also be possible. We're probably going to make it easy for you to 3D print them. We're going to make it easy for you to print out labels if you want to put labels on like a cheap set of dice that you currently own, and we'll probably try to make a digital tool so you can roll them at the table. We'll have a chart that says if you want to use your D8 and convert, like, here you go, right? There's a lot of different things that we're going to do, but that's all to say the reason we did that, and we experimented with using traditional dice, the reason we did that is traditional dice are very swingy. And one reason that D&D combat grinds is that on a D8, for instance, the damage you roll could be a 1, could be an 8. On a D20, your chances of hitting, are somewhere between 1 and 20,
Yeah.
plus a modifier, right? And so those swingy things mean that you're accounting for a lot of that stuff in the math, which means that creatures end up with a lot of hit points, means that combat can go on and grind, right? And that kind of thing. So that's one reason that we're doing that. The other reason we're doing that is heroic fantasy game, right? Cool things happen. There are bouts of luck, the forces of fate. You get bursts of adrenaline, right? And so those symbols allow us to represent all of those different things of like, cool, I rolled some successes, but I also rolled some surges, and those surges allow me to do something cool. And a critical effect allows me to do something really cool, right? So there's that kind of thing to be considered with the dice too. The other thing that we're doing is
I,
we're taking a look at like how can we make the game feel very heroic.
yeah.
So D&D, it works sort of like attrition, right? You start the day, you wake up, you have all of your hit points, all of your spell slots, all of your uses of rage, et cetera, et cetera. You have all of that, and then throughout the day it depletes, and then you have to rest and get it all back, right? That means that combat that goes on long is not fun because you run out of cool things to do, or you're saving them for some big combat, right?
Yeah.
It also means that then in the middle of something exciting, you have to rest, right? And that doesn't feel very heroic. I think that's great for a
And
dungeon
also,
crawler.
it spawned the 2-hour adventuring day, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. The like, okay, we beat up. We had 2 encounters. Now we're going to bed so that we can get everything back.
And your DM's like, but you just got up 2 hours ago.
Exactly. Exactly. And so that's what we're doing is sort of different. Is that you start an adventure with some resources. There are some cool things you can always do. Think of them like at will encounters in 4th edition, right? As you use those, you build up a resource. And as you build that resource, you can use it to do really cool things. So your adventuring day gets better as you go on, that you
And
can do cooler stuff
and
the
you're
longer you
incentivized
adventure.
to not hoard your abilities.
Exactly, right? It's like spend that now, and so that's kind of the basic premise that we're looking at, is like you can always do cool stuff, right? And that stuff gets cooler as the day goes on because you have resources that you can build up, spend, and then build up again. And that to us feels more heroic,
I
right? That's
it
more
is that
Guardians of the
design. Is
Galaxy.
that the design that's been is essentially lifted from video games? Because it feels like the power up bar in a video game that you
Yeah, it
can only
does.
achieve by doing stuff.
Yeah, it definitely does feel like that. There are also some war games that kind of work that way, right? Like
Okay.
as you lose units, you might get a resource, or as so yeah, it's definitely it's not an original idea for us. And I'm sure there
Mm.
are other role-playing games that
Yeah, yeah.
that have worked that way too, right?
There
Um
are no original ideas left. I feel like anyway.
yeah,
It's just
definitely.
like, what's your take on it? You know?
Yeah, exactly. But that's the idea, right? Is that, yeah, you'll have like a power up bar, and
Mm.
everybody's power up bar will work differently, right? So like the beast heart, which is our companion class, right? You have like an animal companion, like an owlbear or something like that with you. They build up ferocity, and they can
Yeah.
use that ferocity to do cool things, both you and your animal
Yeah,
companion.
yeah. Are you guys going to
Um
use an awesome generic stat block?
we are not.
That was definitely me being facetious.
Yeah, I know us. I just don't know
You're
if
from
we are.
Jersey, you understand, but not everybody is.
Oh, I do. Yeah. Yeah, we probably won't be using like a bespoke
Yeah.
generic stat block for that. Yeah. So yeah, that's sort of the basics of what we know about the RPG. We're really early in testing,
Yeah.
and we're just testing internally right now. So in
I,
fact, after this, I
I
am
feel
going to
like there was
run
a lot of
test.
urgency a few weeks ago for everyone to design come up with something new now, and then that's abated a little bit. Like everyone's got a little bit of breathing room.
Well, sure, because we all thought that by the end of 2023 we would have to pay royalties to Watson. um
Possibly give them a firstborn or something.
yeah, exactly. So that is not currently what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I really love by the Power Apocalypse games is the fact that combat is so fast and can be very brutal. Um,
Yeah.
so like you're almost incentivized in some ways to not do it,
Hmm.
because it is so fast and the outcome might be a little less certain.
Definitely. And it all depends on the PBTA game, right? Something
Yeah,
like Masks, it's really hard to die in. Something like Monster of the Week, oh god,
not so hard.
not so hard at all.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's fun. And I think that's the thing, is like we want it to be like, whoa, you had a 2-hour combat, that's awesome, what did you do, right? What did you get
yeah,
to do? The other thing that we've eliminated, or we're trying to eliminate, are null effects on player turns, right? So that it doesn't bother me as much when this happens on the GM's turn, because the GM controls a lot of creatures, but when the
yeah,
player rolls and they miss, and
yeah,
now it's somebody else's turn. That's not fun. That didn't move the story forward. That didn't
yeah,
uh so it feels bad in a lot of ways. And so what we're trying to do is make it that, like, when you roll, you're always going to do something. And it might not be good, right? Like it might
yeah.
be that something bad happens, but the story is going to change whenever you are
Oh
rolling for
yeah, I do like that. Also, like I've also seen systems where the 7D system,
mm-hmm,
Gareth put out DMG info, and it uses the standard polyhedrals, but it's a pool system,
mm-hmm.
and ones are successes. So the lower the die you use, the more likely you are to succeed. But when you don't succeed, you basically get a Benny or a perk to spend next time, so that you
Oh,
get
cool.
something for your effort. And then also,
Right.
like, you're always rolling like specific attributes or abilities. And then when you fail them, you also gain XP or experience in that specific thing. So
Oh,
if you keep doing
interesting.
something you're not good at, you get better at it really
You get
fast.
better at it.
But if you do
Haha.
things that you're good at all the time, it takes a lot longer to get to improve and get better.
That's cool. It encourages you to be well-rounded, right? If you want to be getting better at stuff faster. I like that.
So yeah, so I mean, there's a ton of ways, and if nothing else, that comes from the kerfluffle. Hopefully, people are trying new games now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I would love to see that. It's great to see like, Paizo and Modifius and other places saying that they ran out of product
Yeah.
because so many people went to buy them. And I want people to actually play those games, because I think there's so many good games out there. Yeah.
So I've got very mixed feelings. When like I asked someone, I'm like, "Hey, you thinking about playing something other than D&D?" Like, "Yeah, I'd like to really try Pathfinder." I'm like, "Oh." I'm like, "Don't hurt yourself
Sure.
stretching there." But
Yeah, but I think that's the start, right?
yeah,
For a lot of people, sure, if they try Pathfinder, it's very similar in a
it's.
lot of ways.
I mean, I don't know how you think about it, but I feel like our table, a lot of our tables are just like, "Oh, it's just another D&D."
Oh yeah, yeah. But I do think that if you play just D&D,
Yeah.
um, I think the odds of you playing a third game once you pick up a second game, no matter what that second game is, go up a lot between the odds of you picking up a second game. Does that make sense? That like if you're just playing one, the odds that you're going to play another one are not as good. If you're playing two, the odds that you're going to play a third one, I think, are better
Yeah,
because you start to learn that
you've
like,
begun
oh, it's not
breaking
that
your
hard.
inertia.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you learn that like learning D&D is hard because it's the first time you're wrapping your brain around the concept of a role-playing game.
Yeah.
And
And
that
also
gets
not the
easier with
most
every game you
simple
learn.
game to learn either.
No, I mean it's 900 pages of core rules, right? Yeah, exactly. So,
Like in one of the groups, that we play in together, my wife's
mhm.
in that game and she was really nervous joining that group because that group started playing non D&D games and she'd only played D&D and she's more of a casual player and
Sure.
doesn't have like a super firm grasp of the rules in that game, so it was very intimidating to go to a new set of rules. I'm like, no, you don't understand. It only gets easier from here.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people want to start with D&D because that's what they know. That's what's in the zeitgeist. That's what they're playing on Stranger Things and stuff. So,
Yeah,
and it is like, but like, yeah, I've introduced a lot of people to RPGs using like Monster of the Week or Honey Heist or, and that is a lot easier for most of them. Fiasco, right?
yeah.
To Grok than something else. So Fate, I've seen people introduced via Fate. Yeah. So, and I think for a lot of people, they would much rather have something a little more rules light. So don't be afraid to give that to people.
I personally prefer like D&D 5e is about as complex as I want to get anymore.
Sure.
Uh, and like whenever I look at playing other games, generally I lean more into simpler games, unless it's like a group that I just want to play with, and someone else is going to do the heavy lifting by running the
Yeah.
game, and then I'll just figure it out as I go.
Yeah, that's our groups. The game groups I'm part of, generally we take turns GMing.
Yeah,
And it's like, if you want to play that game, you're the one who's going to run it and you're the one who's going to teach it to everybody else. Great.
yeah.
And then maybe if the group likes it, then maybe somebody else will run it and you'll get to play, right? Like that's kind of how we roll. And so a lot of times it's simpler games because that's what people have the time to run and learn, and sometimes it's not, and that's great because somebody else is teaching it to you. It's a great way to learn a lot of games, is to rotate your GMs, if you have the luxury to do that. Yeah. The
It
other
is.
thing that oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it is very nice, but unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of groups where they've got like one person that runs games. And that's it, sadly.
I think you are correct.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole reason why we went to a model where we just play monthly games, but we play every Saturday with basically different groups.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
it's
just
true.
easier to get people to commit to once a month.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's adult lives are very busy, very hard. But even then we still get to rotate sometimes. Just takes like a year.
Yeah, yeah, essentially, yeah. I mean, because we're like looking at finishing up Demon the Shadow Lord, and we still have what, like 3 more sessions, which is like 3 months away.
Yeah. I love
So
that game though. It's
uh,
so much fun.
it is a lot of fun, and also I think they really do solve the problem of you know we talked about like people only play up to level 8 or whatever. Well, that game only has 11
Right.
levels, and I think by putting the finish line so close, it's easier to push through those last couple levels, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I love that part of
Exactly.
the design. So,
Yeah.
Warhouse Bard, thanks for the super chat. Really
Oh,
appreciate it.
Warhouse Bard.
MCDM, good to see James here. Uh, Carry on. It
Thank you
is
very
always
much,
good to see
Warhouse
James
Bard.
here. You were one of our alumni at this point. You've been on quite a few times.
I thank you for having me on so much, Dave. So I always love talking with you, and the Nerdarchy audience is really great. So thank you really for having me and let me come on and talk about game design and the
So there was
MCDM RPG and
one more
stuff.
thing you said you wanted to mention.
I do, if that's okay.
Yes.
So I've got this book. It's called To Be or Not to Be a Villain. Oh, look, it's double-sided. And it is a an adventure for both fifth edition and for the Zweihander RPG, depending on which way you're reading the book. Um, and it's a game that can support up to 9 players and 2 GMs. And what it is it's like a 12-hour module, basically, where you are the characters in Hamlet. There's pre-gens in here. You use them. They have relationships and connections. And you're trying to determine who will become the next king of Denmark, while the vampire king, Fortinbras, is also a looming threat in the background. And there's backstabbing, there's betrayal. We've play tested the heck out of this game. Every time it goes differently, who ends up being king, because it's all dependent on the players. It's really fun. It was great to make. I made it with my friend Rudy Basso. It's his idea. And essentially the idea is that, like, you don't need a lot of monsters or NPCs because the players are all playing against each other. And so the GM presents scenarios while a second GM basically runs side scenes with everybody else so that they can plot and backstab in another room and that kind of thing. You can run it on Discord, is a great way to do it if you're running it online. You can also run it with as few as 6 players and 1 GM. So you don't need that many people to do it. And the Zweihander version is different than the 5e version. So like the 5e version is more high fantasy. The character relationships are a certain way. The pre-gens are a certain way. All of that changes in Zweihander. It's more of a horror steampunk style world. Hamlet in one is different than Hamlet in another, and yada yada yada. So it's a lot of fun. Part murder mystery, part political drama, part weird vampires and other fantastical stuff. And you don't need to know Hamlet because it's basically inspired by Hamlet, but
Yeah.
you don't need to know or have seen or read Hamlet at all to play it or get it. In fact, in many ways, it's better if you didn't.
Sounds fantastic. Uh, and I like the idea of the duality of it. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's all in one book. Uh,
Thank you.
Now, did you guys produce that on your own? Did you guys produce it for another company?
So we pitched it to Andrews McMeel, who has the license to publish Zweihander. And that's why we had the 5e version and they said, could you also do a Zweihander version? And we were like, yeah, we could. And so they are the publishers who put it out, but we had already written it.
Okay.
When we pitched it to them. So yeah, it's our idea. Rudy and I are the authors, and we've shepherded it all the way through. There's also great art from an artist named Art Teapot in here. It's like a very specific style. They also did the incredible covers and everything. But yeah, it was a big collaboration with the Art Teapot and Andrews McMeel. And so yeah, and we also put some like unique mechanics in there. So there are there are 5 acts, and each act is a day. And at the end of the day, there is a night phase where your character can do something, like spy on somebody else or spread a rumor about somebody else or that kind of thing. And so there's rules for what to do during the night phase and that sort of thing in here as well. It was a lot of fun.
Sounds like it's got like cool, interesting takes on some of the things that might be a little bit familiar to us. Well, I don't
Yeah.
want to hold you hostage too long. I know you've got a busy busy day probably. You've always got a lot of things going on,
Thank
and
you, Dave. Thank
at
you.
some point MCDM is going to want you back today. Uh,
Yes, I've got to go run a test. Run a test of the inevitable MCDM RPG.
yeah. So, and we're past the hour mark by a bit. So, with that, final thoughts before we head on out.
My final thought is, Dave, you are a great human. Thank you for having me. And Nerdarchy's awesome. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on, James. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Until next time, everyone, stay nerdy.
Woo.
And we're out.